Hey folks, Matt Hinkley here with Cressey Sports Performance. I wanted to go over a quick little case study. This is something that we've been encountering a little bit more frequently with several of our pro guys that come in to work with us as we're staying in touch with these guys during the season. It's becoming increasingly more popular for guys to get like stuff plus grades given to them after each outing. I know there's a handful of orgs that this is a little bit more of a popular trend than others, but this is something that we're encountering relatively frequently. I think the biggest thing that's jumping out at me is guys are just given these numbers without much context. So we actually ran into a situation a couple weeks ago with an athlete that reached out that said, "Hey, like I feel like I'm pitching okay, but why are my pitch grades so bad? I feel like I'm throwing well. I feel like my pitches are working the way that they're supposed to. Can you kind of take a peek?" And I've protected his name here. You can see it's John Doe, but wanted to kind of dive into a little bit of some of the things that go into these grading models and how context is really important. So if you can appreciate, like when we plug the metrics in based on available, Hawkeye or TrackMan data that we have available to us, you'll notice that our model average is 100. That's major league average. So his four-seam fastball, we have it in the four-seam evaluator, graded out at a 75. So that's 25% below major league average, and that's based purely on obviously like our weighting model is unique to CSP. We came relatively close to the grade that he was getting from the org. But if you'll notice, his performance plus score is 21% above major league average. So a pitch that in a vacuum, when you're calling it a four seam, and I'll get into that here in a minute, shouldn't exactly perform well. But when you look at all the context involved, it could be how good of a command he has with the pitch. It could be the situations that he throws the pitch in. It could be the third thing, which we'll talk about here in a minute. But I think that it's important to appreciate that just because a pitch in a vacuum is not performing up to major league standard, it can still perform well if used properly. And you'll see this a lot with guys that have 5 or 6 pitch mixes in their arsenals. If everything's at league average or below league average, they have a lot of pitches. Granted, there's guys like Edwin Diaz that can get by with 1 or 2 pitches that if 2 pitches are good enough, that's all it can take at times. So, but I want you guys to watch what happens here. We plugged the exact same pitch that was called a four seam in this other evaluator. It graded out at a 75 into our cutter evaluator, and this had a little bit to do with just the characteristics of the way the pitch was actually moving. And you can appreciate that he went from a 25% below league average pitch to a 1% above major league average pitch simply by changing the name. So I think it's important to understand that like the names can be relatively arbitrary. I think that this is more common when it comes to the spectrum of slider, cutter, and sweeper. But even with fastballs, guys that have a little bit of funk to their heaters might not exactly grade glaringly well in a traditional four-seam evaluator. But if you throw it into something that fits the profile of the pitch or whatever the traditional movement profile is, again, granted, if this looked at as a cutter, you could argue that it's going like 4 inches the wrong way from a horizontal break standpoint. But I mean, not a crazy amount of hop on it, pretty close to the line as far as horizontal movement's concerned, and he throws it hard. And as you can see here, it's like goes from being a below average pitch to an above average pitch simply by changing the name. Vast majority of stuff plus models are going to weight things differently based on what we would call a good or a bad outcome for each specific pitch. I think it's important, and there's a lesson to be learned here, that something as arbitrary as like what a guy with a weird fastball decides to name his pitch can impact the feedback that he's getting from his org. And I think given a little bit more context, I was like, hey, dude, how do you feel about just changing the name of your four-seamer to a cutter? And all will be right in the world. And we laughed about it. But again, this is something that I think a lot of guys are going to encounter. And I think it's important to be armed with some context here. It's obviously not always crucial for every single athlete to understand every single thing that goes into creating a pitch grading model, but I do think it's important if you're going to be walking away from an outing where you feel like you've pitched well and like get some type of negative thought in your head about it. I do think it's important to appreciate the fact that it could be something as trivial as the whatever you're naming the pitch. So if you guys have more questions about this, please feel free to reach out to me. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, whatever. Again, this is probably a little bit more geared to our pro crowd, but I do think it's important for several of the college guys that we interact with to understand this process, because I mean, if you're a prospect, you're eventually going to be an organization, and stuff plus is becoming more of a more commonplace. So being able to understand, what goes into this process, I do think is important. So thanks, guys.